All right, so hello and welcome. Today we're going to be reacting to when did Britain and America stop hating each other? Okay, the original video is going to be in the description as well as the Patreon if you want to vote on some videos. Otherwise, I'm going to try to add some perspective to this as a military historian, but I don't know how much I'm going to be able to add in 4-minute videos. So let's get on with it.
It would be an understatement to say that Britain and the USA's relationship got off to a rocky start. In 1812, Britain and America were at war, but just over a century later, they were fighting shoulder to shoulder in World War I.
Yeah, that's a bit of a pretty much more or less. War of 1812 happens. We really haven't gone to war with Britain since. We've had skirmishes on the border with the Maine over where exactly the line was. But that's really it from what I can possibly think of.
Which obviously raises the question, when did Britain and America become allies? There had to be a point where both went from actively disliking each other to working alongside each other. Now, before continuing, it's important to note that even in the immediate aftermath of independence, America and Britain still had strong economic ties. This isn't to say that things were always great between the two, and there were some pretty major conflicts of interest in the years after the War of 1812 finished.
Yes, so America and Britain, even after the American Revolution, we were very much still trading, and we were aligned with each other. And it's very simple because for reasons why, right? We speak the same language. A lot of them came from Britain, and they are the number one world power at this time. So economically, being able to trade with them is very good. So we did. Now remember, we're having different problems in the cabinet, right? So George Washington's cabinet, Alexander Hamilton, everyone knows as Secretary of the Treasury. I think at the time it might have been called something else. And then you had Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. And Alexander Hamilton wanted to follow their model, and Thomas Jefferson wanted to follow the model of France and be more friendly to France, right? So we've always had a little dichotomy there. And even today, I would say that Americans have more relations with Britain than they do France, even though France helped us out, right? More or less because we can actually speak the language. That's what I would guess too.
The first, and perhaps the most obvious, was the Monroe Doctrine, established in 1823. This was where the United States, by threat of military intervention, declared an end to any new European colonial adventures in the Americas. And for Britain, this was potentially a problem because it had economic interest in South America. In reality, though, it wasn't too much of a problem at all, because in 1833 it landed a force on the Falkland Islands and America did nothing. In 1842, the US did warn Britain against interference in Hawaii, which Britain did heed because America's international power was certainly growing.
Now, yes, the Monroe Doctrine took place in what? He said 1833, 1832. So, let's be honest here. America was not really in a position to actually threaten anyone that was going to do something. So, as you said, Britain took the Falklands. The Monroe Doctrine basically stay away from everything in America's North and South. And we weren't the power we were back then, or we are today, right? It was a hit or miss on whether they really would enforce the doctrine at this point, but as he says, America's power is growing, right? So by 1870, 1860s, it would have actually been a problem.
It was this fact that America was a rapidly growing great power whose interests could no longer be ignored, which would dominate Anglo-American relations for the following century. So the next major event which could have changed the Anglo-American dynamic was the American Civil War, which broke out in 1861. Britain had already abolished slavery at this point, and so you would think that it would have preferred the Union over the Confederacy. But you'd be wrong. Now, Britain had no great affection for the Confederacy in its slaveholding practices. Its preferential treatment was purely economic, mostly due to cotton imports. Britain did consider formally recognising the Confederacy, and Anglo-American relations were severely harmed by what's called the Trent Affair. This was where the US government seized a ship with Confederate diplomats headed for Britain, which to Britain looked like the USA telling it who it could and could not speak to. In the end, cooler heads prevailed and Britain didn't get involved, although it did construct a very powerful warship, the CSS Alabama, for the Confederacy. And after the Civil War was over...
Okay, so something with the Trent Affair. From what I remember, and as he said, it was for Confederate diplomats to actually see the British, and the Union stopped them. Britain's not going to be a country that's like, hey, yeah, you can tell us who we can talk to and not. No, that wasn't the problem. The problem was the USA telling Britain who they could actually talk to. And that affair could have very well led to a war, but it didn't. Also, the abolition movement in Britain happened... It really happened starting after the Napoleonic Wars. It wasn't because it was seen as immoral, okay? That's the reason they started to overturn it. and it had a lot of popular support in the liberals, and not so in the conservatives. And there's a whole section we could do just on how that happened. But at this time, Britain had abolished slavery, um, more or less. I'm trying to. It had abolished slavery, but indentured servitude, dot dot dot, not second class citizen, all that stuff still applies, right? And Britain did favor the Confederacy because cotton. That's what I will say is the upper side. The lower classes would favor the Union, but the upper crust, the ones that actually make all that ones that would control the factories and everything else, favored the Confederacy for the simple fact of the cotton. But they just went to Egypt and got cotton there, so it wasn't really a big deal for them.
Britain paid compensation to the United States. Thus, only 50 years away from World War I, Britain and America still didn't really care much for each other. So what changed this? Well, relations actually started to improve during Britain's border dispute with Venezuela in 1895. This developed into somewhat of a crisis, and the US intervened and arbitrated, siding mostly with Britain. For Britain, America had conducted itself in a well-mannered fashion and given Britain most of what it had wanted. And for America, by accepting American arbitration, Britain had yielded its right to influence South America. The other reason for
Yeah, basically, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? Good global powers, interacting with each other and favoring them over a country, let's be honest, at this point was a third world country. I can see that being a lot of political influence there. And having these countries both align with each other is way better than having Venezuela, a country that America was supposed to be protecting. It's just beneficial politically better for America and Britain to work together on that affair than it would be for America to work with Venezuela and piss Britain off.
American rapprochement was simple: converging interests. America had emerged from its civil war a more centralized industrial power, and after its defeat of Spain in 1898, it possessed a global...
Defeating Spain in 1898, by the way, it was an absolute joke. The Spanish armies, basically, and the navies. Their empire was gone or dying at this point, and that was just the final blow to finish off the Spanish Empire in all reality.
Global empire too. And for Britain, things were rapidly changing as well. Its empire and global position was being threatened by Russia and the newly formed Germany. Britain had long practiced a policy of isolationism with respect to the European powers, but since they too were industrialising, this had the potential to threaten Britain's position. Thus, her most natural ally seemed to be the United States, since it was half a world away and had its own sphere of influence, plus they spoke the same language and shared many values. It was at the turn of the 20th century under President Theodore Roosevelt that America and Britain really started to become friends, particularly with respect to one foreign policy stance. They didn't like Germany. This agreement allowed for Britain to move its fleet away from its Caribbean colonies back to Britain to defend itself from Germany, while security in the Caribbean would fall to the US. After the First World War broke out, Germany's actions such as U-boat attacks on American shipping and the Zimmermann telegram, combined with the fact that if Britain and France lost the war, they wouldn't be able to pay their American loans back as...
Yes, that was a lot of money, by the way. Whew! I don't think they finished paying it off until well after World War II for paying it off. And it did actually bankrupt Britain pretty heavily. So, fun fact, before World War I, Britain was the center of the world in terms of the economy, where everything was based off of the sterling pound. After World War I, it was New York. New York City. You can see how that could be a very big problem and very big turn point.
Assured US intervention on their side, and from that point onwards both the US and UK were largely in the same camps, barring a couple of mishaps here and there. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.
Alright, so that's the end of the video. I think it's very well done, especially for basically a 4-minute video covering all this topic. Yeah, I hope my insight was kind of insightful there. If you like this video, go ahead and leave a like. Otherwise, I will see you people next time.